Hello. In the First World War, all air forces were under direct control of their armies, and thus aircraft had to perform exclusively direct support missions for ground units, such as gaining air superiority and attacking enemy ground targets. When called upon to attack enemy ground units, first let us consider air interdiction missions. And this meant hitting enemy ground units while they were on their way to the front, either moving on roads or railways. Against those dense targets, bombs and machine guns could easily decimate them. And the other mission for air units was close air support. And this mission happens directly over the battlefield. And it can take two forms: either deep close support, which happens against enemy units not in contact with your own troops, including attacks on enemy artillery or reserves moving to contact. And then we have the very close air support missions, which happens when the air units attack the enemy who is in contact with your own units. Later on, by the start of the Second World War, Western air forces were already seeking their independence from their own armies, and for that reason, the air forces increased their allocation of resources to such missions as strategic bombing campaigns and gaining air superiority. And the air forces also distinguished themselves with interdiction missions, strafing and bombing enemy units en route to the battlefield. Also, they performed and were somewhat effective in close support missions. But in these missions, there were many times when the aircraft attacked their own units. And also, air units suffered heavy losses when they provided close air support. Thus, towards the last days of that war, Western Air Force commanders were allocating less and less resources for close air support. On the other hand, we have the Germans. When they started their rearmament in the early 1930s, few of their resources were allocated to strategic bombing, and the Luftwaffe's main mission was to support the Wehrmacht by gaining air superiority and attacking ground targets. And for that mission, the Germans had many medium and light bombers, including the famous Ju-87 Stukas. But at the beginning of the war, that plane was already considered obsolete. Nevertheless, the Stukas were really useful in both interdiction and deep close air support missions. But when these were called upon to carry out very close air support, even this plane had two problems. Since their attack runs started from a great height, it was really difficult for the crew to identify friends from foes, both in close combat and in fluid actions. And in the second place, their launch bomb could be dropped as far as 50 meters from the target. So, in a very close air support mission, their big 500-pound bomb could be dropped in the wrong place and could wipe out their own units. To provide good, very close air support missions, all the major powers entered the war with specialized planes. The United States had the A-39 Ira Cobra, and Germany had the Henschel HS-123. In their missions, these planes could fly really low, strafing and dropping bombs. And at the beginning of the war, the HS-123s were effective both in Poland and France. But after the Battle of France, these planes were briefly replaced by the Ju-87s, only to return a year later in the fighting in Russia, because the HS-123s were more accurate for very close air support missions, and for that reason, they were used until 1944. But these planes used for very close air support missions had one flaw. They had no armor. And the problem is that, to properly identify friends from foes, pilots had to fly very low and at a low speed, making them easy targets, and for that reason, these planes required armor protection against the large number of weapons that the enemy ground forces could use against them. That problem had already been recognized even since the First World War. In the last stages of that war, Allied planes making strafing runs were of great help against German attacks, and those planes were also very useful in supporting their own offensives. But having no armor, the Allied aircraft assigned to those missions suffered substantial losses. For example, the British Royal Flying Corps reported 30% losses in those squadrons assigned to close air support missions. The Germans were the first to find a solution for that vulnerability, and by the fall of 1917 they deployed the Junkers G4, an aircraft designed with armor protection for its engine and its crew. This German aircraft was slow, but their armor was a proper protection and that plane was rather effective. After the First World War, there were experiments with armored aircraft, but at the beginning of the Second World War, neither the Western Allies nor the Germans had armored aircraft. Thus, without protection, their effectiveness in close air support mission was limited. On the other hand, the Soviet Union was the exception. After receiving reports from the Spanish Civil War about the effectiveness of strafing troops on the ground and the vulnerability of planes against ground fire, by the end of the 1930s, the Soviets developed the Ilyushin Il-2 Shturmovik, an airplane with armor protection for its engine, cabin, and fuel tanks. And if we have to recognize something about that Soviet plane, it was a solid machine, capable of absorbing a lot of damage. The Soviets recognized the enormous value of that plane and built between 31 to 36,000 of them, more planes than any other type built in the war. And this is really shown in air interdiction missions. But there is an issue. Because those aircraft only had light 23mm guns, they were of little use against heavy armored vehicles, and we have to remember that the Second World War was the debut of the great masses of armored vehicles, and by 1943, all aircraft equipped with bombs, light cannons, and machine guns had little chance of stopping medium and heavy tanks. To fight against tanks, in 1941, the British sought to create an anti-tank plane, and their obsolete Hurricane fighters were armed with two 40mm cannons. British pilots claimed numerous victories, but also remarked that the heavy weapons slowed the plane down, making it vulnerable to ground fire. To solve that dilemma, they added 350 pounds of armor, which in turn made the plane even slower and more difficult to fly. And in the end, those planes were withdrawn from service. 3 years later, at Normandy, we have the Typhoon fighter bomber equipped with anti-tank rockets. On August 7, 1944, at Mortain, these planes were used in interdiction missions and fired 2,088 rockets against German units and claimed the destruction of 84 armored vehicles, 35 damage, and 21 probables. But after the battle, 46 armored vehicles were inspected, and only 7 of those were hit by rockets. Thus, the pilots' reports had been greatly exaggerated. Simply put it, the rockets were not accurate. These could fall as far as 25 meters from their targets. Even so, until the end of the war, rockets were preferred over bombs as anti-tank weapons, because rockets could be launched from a greater distance, and that made them less vulnerable to ground fire. But by the end of the war, the Western Allies were never able to field a true anti-tank aircraft. For their part, the Soviets also failed in that regard. They also used big bombs and rockets on their excellent Il-2s, as anti-tank weapons. But these had the same accuracy problem. As an option, some of their planes received 37mm guns, and their pilots claimed many victories at Kursk. But after 1943, production of those planes was stopped. The Soviets were also among the first to use cluster munitions against tanks. Each EL-2 could be equipped with 192 anti-tank bomblets, which launched from 100 meters, covered a distance of 70 by 15 meters, giving this a good chance of hitting a target. But this type of attack was also abandoned. So, the Soviets also failed to have a good anti-tank aircraft for the Second World War. Finally, we have the Germans. And even their famous Stukas had problems when they wanted to achieve pinpoint hits with bombs against tanks. And after 1942, when they started facing more and more waves of Soviet armor, they were hard-pressed to field more anti-tank weapons. And for that mission, they built two types of aircraft. 200 Stukas were equipped with 37mm guns. But with their limited resources, the Germans did not produce any more of these planes. The 37mm gun was very accurate, but its shell could only penetrate the armor above the turret and engine of a medium or a heavy tank. Thus, the attack vector for these planes was from the rear at low speed, and the pilots had to be very careful, because the recoil from their guns caused the nose of the plane to drop and it could crash. Famed pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel, credited with destroying 519 Soviet armored vehicles, noted that the plane's worst problem was its aerodynamics. The Ju-87Gs were not practical aircraft. And then they had the HS-129B1, a small twin-engine armored aircraft equipped with 30mm guns that saw action on the Eastern Front from late 1942. Structurally strong, but with the flight characteristics of a penguin. The HS-129s were not appreciated by their pilots, but as some of them claimed a substantial number of victories, in October 1944, the HS-129B3, equipped with a 75mm gun, went into action. That was the largest anti-tank gun ever put on an aircraft, but the weight and size of it made the plane even more difficult to fly, and the recoil of the gun slowed the plane down by 10 miles per hour and caused it to jerk dangerously. Some successes were claimed, but the fact that only 25 were built shows that these planes were also failures. To have an anti-tank plane in the Second World War, three problems had to be solved. The planes had to fly at low altitude to both identify targets and have the best angle of attack, exposing themselves to ground fire. Second, in those days only cannons were accurate, but bigger guns made planes difficult to fly. And third, being slow and requiring time to align their weapons against heavy tanks, the planes had to be armored, which added to their flight problems. After the Second World War, the consensus among air commanders was this: attacking small tactical targets, such as heavy armored vehicles, was impractical, and only endangered the aircraft and their crews. From the air commander's point of view, the best option was to use interdiction missions against support units, thus destroying fuel and ammunition sent to the front will stop enemy tanks. For a while, it seemed that armored close air support aircraft with anti-tank capability were no longer an option. But then, 20 years later, in the case of the United States, we will see that with the experience in Vietnam, the added threat of facing large armored waves of tanks from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, together with an internal fight for the budget against attack helicopters, pushed the United States to create a new specialized aircraft, the A-10 Thunderbolt, an aircraft whose story we will see in a future video. Well, I hope that you liked this video, and if you did, please leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. That is a great help. And you can also support me to my Patreon account, which is also a great help for me to continue creating this content. Regards from Guatemala, Victor Aguilar-Chang.